I want you to really focus for the next few minutes because what I'm about to explain is not just a prediction. It's a framework. And once you see it, you won't be able to look at what's happening right now the same way again. Everyone is asking the same question. How does this end? And the truth is, it doesn't end in 100 different ways. It ends in 2. Only 2. And everything depends on one single decision. One line that, once crossed, cannot be undone. Does America put boots on the ground in Iran or not? That's it. That is the dividing line between a controlled retreat and a potential disaster that reshapes global power for decades. So let's walk through this slowly, because the difference between these two outcomes is not small. It is the difference between a strategic loss and a historic collapse. First scenario, no ground troops. Everything stays in the air. Missiles, drones, airstrikes, precision bombing, long-range warfare. From the outside, this looks like dominance. It looks like control. It looks like the most powerful military in the world doing exactly what it was designed to do. But underneath that surface, something very different is happening. Because air wars don't end quickly when the opponent is structured for endurance. They stretch, they drag, they become wars of time, not wars of impact. And every single day that this continues, the cost accumulates. Quietly at first, then visibly, then politically. Missile defense systems are not infinite. Interceptors are not infinite. Budgets are not infinite. Political patience is definitely not infinite. And here is the part most people miss. You don't need to win outright to win. You just need to make continuing too expensive. That's the game. So the strikes continue. Iran absorbs them, responds, not symmetrically, not directly, but persistently. Drone swarms, missile pressure, regional disruption. And suddenly this isn't just a military situation anymore. It's economic. Oil prices don't need to skyrocket permanently. They just need to stay elevated long enough to create pressure. Markets react to uncertainty more than reality. Insurance rates rise, shipping costs rise, energy volatility spreads. And that pressure doesn't stay in the Middle East. It hits Europe, it hits Asia, it hits the global economy. Now layer something else on top of that. Domestic politics. At the beginning of any conflict, there is always momentum. There is always a narrative of strength, of necessity, of justification. But time changes that. As the months pass, the questions start. What is the objective? Are we achieving it? What is this costing us? How long does this continue? And most importantly, what is the end game? Because air power alone rarely produces regime change. It produces pressure. It produces damage. But it does not produce control. And without control, the conflict doesn't resolve. It lingers. So now you have rising costs, unclear outcomes, and growing political pressure. And at some point, and this is always the turning point, the question shifts from can we continue to why are we continuing? And once that question takes hold, the trajectory is already set. Because now leadership is no longer trying to win decisively. They are trying to exit strategically. And exits are never framed as losses. They are framed as success. Carefully, deliberately. You'll hear phrases like objectives achieved, capabilities degraded, mission accomplished. And on the surface, it will sound like closure. But structurally, what's actually happening is withdrawal. Gradual at first, then decisive. And the moment that withdrawal becomes visible, something else happens. The region recalibrates. Because power is not just about presence, it's about perceived permanence. And once permanence is questioned, alignment begins to shift. States that relied on external protection begin to hedge. Quietly at first, back-channel communication, strategic neutrality, economic diversification. Some move closer to emerging regional powers. Others strengthen alternative alliances. And what you end up with is not a collapse, but a reconfiguration, a slow redistribution of influence. And in that space, one thing becomes clear. Iran is still there, still intact, still functional, still positioned at one of the most strategically important choke points in the world. And that alone changes the balance. So in this first scenario, the outcome is not dramatic. There is no single moment where everything collapses. Instead, there is a gradual recognition that the cost of maintaining the previous structure is too high. And so the structure changes. America steps back, not destroyed, not defeated in a traditional sense, but repositioned, weakened in influence, reduced in control, and the system becomes more multipolar, more fragmented, more unpredictable. That is scenario 1. Now let's move to scenario 2. And this is where everything changes, because this is the scenario that crosses the line. This is where the logic of limited engagement breaks down. This is where the stakes escalate in a way that cannot be easily reversed. Ground troops, not advisors. Not special operations, not symbolic deployments. Large-scale, sustained, physical presence inside Iranian territory. And the moment that happens, the nature of the conflict transforms completely. Because now it is no longer about pressure. It is about control. And control requires something very different from air dominance. It requires occupation, movement through terrain, securing supply lines, holding territory, managing resistance. And Iran is not designed to be easily occupied. Geography alone makes that clear. Mountains, urban density, infrastructure built with defense in mind. But geography is only part of it. The real factor is preparation. Because unlike sudden conflicts, this is a scenario that has been anticipated for decades, studied, modeled, planned for. Defensive systems layered across terrain, underground facilities, hardened positions, distributed capabilities, and more importantly, a strategic mindset built around one assumption: that if ground forces ever arrive, the objective is not to defeat them quickly. It is to entangle them, to stretch the conflict, to turn it into a war of endurance. And here is where the risk multiplies. Because once troops are on the ground, escalation is no longer optional. It becomes necessary. More troops are required to stabilize positions. More resources are required to sustain them. More operations are required to secure surrounding regions. And suddenly, this is no longer a contained conflict. It begins to expand regionally. Because once one major power is deeply committed on the ground, other actors begin to move. Not necessarily directly, but strategically. Pressure increases on multiple fronts. Supply routes become vulnerable. Regional stability decreases. And what was originally a focused operation becomes a complex, multi-dimensional conflict. At the same time, something else happens back home. Because ground wars are visible in a way that air wars are not. They involve people, large numbers of people. And sustaining that requires manpower, significant manpower, which raises a question that becomes unavoidable. Where does that manpower come from? Because modern militaries are not structured for massive, prolonged ground occupations without expansion. And expansion means mobilization. And mobilization changes everything domestically. Public perception shifts, debate intensifies, division increases, because now the cost is no longer abstract. It's personal. And when a conflict becomes personal at scale, political stability becomes harder to maintain. So now you have external escalation and internal pressure rising at the same time. And this is the trap. Because once you are fully committed, withdrawing becomes harder, not easier. Because leaving without achieving clear objectives carries a higher perceived cost. So the instinct is to stay longer, to push harder, to try to force a decisive outcome. But the longer that continues, the deeper the entanglement becomes. And at some point, the cost curve stops being linear. It becomes exponential, economically, politically, strategically. And that is where systems begin to break. Not instantly, but progressively. And if that process goes far enough, the outcome is no longer just a loss in one region. It becomes a structural weakening of the entire system that sustained the intervention. That is scenario 2. And that is why it is fundamentally different. One leads to controlled disengagement. The other risks uncontrollable escalation. Now here is the critical part. These are not equal probabilities, because decision makers are not blind to these outcomes. They understand the implications. They understand the cost. They understand the risk of escalation, which is why, despite appearances, the threshold for full ground invasion remains extremely high. There may be signals, movements, positioning, but crossing that line is a different level of commitment entirely. And that brings us to the predictions. Not guesses, not speculation, but conclusions based on structure. First, a full-scale ground invasion is unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely. Because the cost is not just military, it is political, economic, social, and those combined pressures create resistance to escalation at the highest levels. Second, the conflict, if it remains limited, will trend toward eventual disengagement. Not immediately, not quickly, but gradually. As costs accumulate and pressure builds, the incentive to exit increases, and eventually a pathway to withdrawal is found. Third, the long-term result is not stability in the traditional sense. It is redistribution, a shift from a unipolar structure to a more fragmented, multipolar environment, where regional powers have greater influence, where external control is reduced, and where the balance is maintained through competition rather than dominance. Now understand something. None of this is about certainty. It's about direction. Because large systems rarely change overnight. They evolve under pressure. And when enough pressure is applied for long enough, the outcome becomes predictable, not in exact detail, but in trajectory. And the trajectory here is clear. The question is not whether change is happening. It's how far it goes before it stabilizes. And that depends on decisions that have not yet been made. What most people don't understand is that wars like this are not decided on the battlefield first. They are decided in something much quieter, much slower, and far more dangerous. They are decided in systems. Because by the time a missile is launched, by the time a drone hits its target, by the time a headline reaches your screen, the real decisions have already been made months, sometimes years earlier. And right now, those decisions are colliding all at once. You are not watching a war begin. You are watching a system reach its limit. And when systems reach their limit, they don't fail gracefully. They snap. Now here is where it gets uncomfortable, because if you zoom out just a little bit, you start to realize something that most analysts refuse to say out loud. America is not just managing a conflict overseas. It is managing pressure from every direction at the same time. Military pressure, economic pressure, political pressure, and psychological pressure. And the reason that matters is simple. History shows that no empire collapses because of one problem. It collapses because too many problems hit at once, and the system can no longer absorb the shock. That is exactly the situation we are moving toward. Now let me slow this down, because this is the part where everything starts to connect. On the surface, the war looks controlled. There are strikes, there are responses, there are statements from leaders trying to project confidence. It looks like a managed escalation. But underneath that surface, something very different is happening. Every strike that does not end the war, increases the pressure to escalate. Every response that fails to deter reduces credibility. And every passing day without a clear outcome weakens the perception of control. And perception in geopolitics is everything. Because once allies start to doubt you, once markets start to question you, once your own population starts to lose confidence, you are no longer just fighting your opponent. You are fighting the collapse of belief in your own power. And that is a much harder war to win. Now think about what that means in real terms. At the beginning of a conflict, there is always an assumption that things will be resolved quickly, that there is a plan, that there is an endpoint, that someone, somewhere is in control. But what happens when weeks turn into months and that endpoint never appears? What happens when every decisive action leads to another reaction and the cycle just continues? This is where fatigue begins. Not just physical fatigue, but strategic fatigue, decision fatigue, narrative fatigue. And once fatigue sets in, mistakes follow. Now here is where things start to accelerate. Because while America is dealing with this growing pressure, Iran is operating on a completely different timeline. Iran does not need a quick victory. Iran does not need dominance. Iran only needs survival. And that changes everything. Because a country that only needs to survive can afford to wait. It can absorb damage. It can stretch the timeline. It can turn time itself into a weapon. And that is exactly what is happening. Every day that passes without resolution is not neutral. It is not nothing happening. It is pressure building in one direction. Now layer on the economic dimension, because this is where the real shift begins. Wars are expensive. Everyone knows that. But what most people don't realize is that modern wars are not just paid for with money. They are paid for with confidence. Confidence in your currency, confidence in your markets, Confidence in your ability to sustain pressure longer than your opponent. And once that confidence starts to crack, the cost of the war multiplies. Because now you are not just funding a war, you are defending your entire financial system at the same time. Now imagine this playing out over months. Energy prices remain unstable. Shipping routes become uncertain. Insurance costs rise. Global trade slows down. And countries that depend on stability begin to panic quietly, not publicly, not dramatically, but strategically. They start asking a simple question. What if this does not end anytime soon? And once that question enters the system, behavior changes. Countries begin to hedge. They reduce exposure. They build alternatives. They create backup systems. And here is the critical part. Those alternatives do not disappear when the war ends. They become permanent. This is how influence erodes, not through one big collapse, but through thousands of small adjustments that slowly remove you from the center of the system. Now let's bring this back to the internal situation, because this is where things become even more fragile. Inside America, the pressure does not stay contained. It spreads. Every decision made overseas has consequences at home. Every dollar spent has a political cost. Every escalation creates division. And over time, the war stops being about strategy and starts being about survival politically. And when leaders start thinking about political survival, decision-making changes. Short-term thinking increases. Risk tolerance shifts. And the probability of miscalculation rises. Now combine all of this. A prolonged conflict with no clear victory. Economic strain building quietly in the background. Political division increasing internally. And external powers watching, waiting, adjusting. This is not just a difficult situation. This is a compounding one, where each problem makes the others worse. And once you are inside a compounding crisis, time is no longer your ally. It becomes your enemy. Because every additional day increases the cost of every possible outcome. Now here is the moment that changes everything. Not the beginning of the war, not the first strike, but the first major miscalculation. Because in conflicts like this, it is not always the planned actions that determine the outcome. It is the unplanned ones, the unexpected escalation, the event that forces a decision before anyone is ready to make it. And when that moment comes, there are only two types of responses, controlled or reactive. And historically, under enough pressure, most systems become reactive. That is when escalation becomes unpredictable. That is when lines that were supposed to never be crossed start to blur. And that is when the risk of scenario 2, the ground entanglement, quietly comes back into play. Not as a strategy, but as a consequence. Because once a certain threshold is crossed, options start to disappear. And leaders are left choosing between bad decisions and worse ones. Now pause for a second and think about this. Because this is the part most people underestimate. Wars are not just about what you want to do. They are about what you are forced to do. And the longer a conflict continues, the more your choices are shaped by pressure, not preference. Now imagine we are months into this. The war has not ended. The costs have increased. The pressure has built. And then something happens. Something big enough to demand a response. Not necessarily catastrophic, but undeniable. A moment that shifts the conversation from should we escalate to how do we respond? And in that moment, everything speeds up. Decisions that would have taken weeks are made in hours. Risks that would have been unacceptable become necessary. And the system moves closer to the edge. This is how escalation actually happens. Not in one dramatic leap, but in a series of smaller steps that feel justified at the time. Until suddenly, you look back and realize how far you have gone. Now here is the deeper layer. Because while all of this is happening, the rest of the world is not standing still. China is watching. Russia is calculating. India is positioning. Regional powers are adjusting. And every one of them is asking the same question. What does the world look like if America cannot maintain control? And more importantly, how do we prepare for that world now? Because the biggest shifts in global power do not happen after a conflict ends. They happen during it, when attention is divided, when resources are stretched, when focus is elsewhere. That is when new systems are built, new alliances are formed, new structures begin to take shape, quietly, gradually, but permanently. And by the time the conflict is over, those changes are already locked in. Now bring everything together. Military pressure that does not resolve quickly. Economic pressure that builds silently. Political pressure that grows internally. Global pressure from other powers adjusting in real time. And the constant risk of a trigger event that forces escalation. This is not just a war. This is a stress test of systems, of leadership, of strategy, of endurance. And the outcome of that stress test will determine far more than who wins or loses on the battlefield. It will determine who adapts and who doesn't. Because in the end, that is what this comes down to. Adaptation, not strength. Not dominance, but the ability to recognize limits and adjust before it is too late. And history is very clear about this. The most dangerous moment for any powerful nation is the moment it believes it has no limits. Because that is when it stops adapting. That is when it overextends. And that is when it walks into traps it cannot escape. So when you look at everything happening right now, do not just see a conflict. See a system under pressure. See the signals. See the patterns. Because those patterns are telling a story. A story about where this is heading. Not with certainty, but with increasing clarity. And that clarity points in one direction. A prolonged conflict that reshapes the balance of power. An eventual shift away from dominance toward distribution. And a world that looks very different on the other side of this. More fragmented, more competitive, more unpredictable, but also more balanced. Because when one system holds too much power for too long, correction becomes inevitable. And that correction is rarely smooth. We are watching that correction begin right now, in real time. And the only real question left is how far it goes before it stabilizes. Because it will stabilize eventually. It always does. But what it looks like when it does depends entirely on what happens next. And that is the part nobody can control completely.